I'm in Atlanta at Emory University in my office. Where are y'all?
I'm in Bogota, Colombia.
I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. This is Marvin.
I'm in Cucuta, Colombia. It's the border with Venezuela.
Oh man, this really is modern spirit.
Welcome back to the Modern Spirit Podcast, a show dedicated to demonstrating the value of spiritual healing in modern healthcare. I'm Natasha Pentin, the co-host alongside Dr. Joe Tafur. Before we jump in, we just wanted to share a quick disclaimer.
The content of this podcast is presented for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Listeners are strongly advised to consult with a licensed physician or other qualified healthcare provider for any health concerns or before making any changes to their medical care, including considering or using any substances mentioned herein. The experiences described are personal and may not be applicable or safe for everyone.
This week, Dr. Joe Tafur and I will be speaking to Roman Palitsky. He's the Director of Research Projects for Emory Spiritual Health, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science, and faculty in the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality. He runs the lab for Existential Behavioral Medicine, which investigates the pathways through which culture and health interact by examining the biological, psychological, and social processes that shape these pathways. He leads the Post-Psychedelic and the meditation-related challenges studies, which seek to understand persisting adverse effects after psychedelics and meditation, as well as strategies to address these challenges. He is also project lead on the Mosaic Initiative, which includes a number of studies that investigate how psychedelics are shaping and being shaped by people's religious and spiritual lives. Roman, thank you so much for joining us today. So I guess we often start off with just talking about how your path and Joe's path may have crossed and where you've seen each other before and what kind of brought you guys together.
It was at the MAPS 2023 where we had both been invited. I was invited in, and then also a group from Emory was there to present, and we were presenting. The workshop day was Psychedelics and Spirituality, and that was the first time that I got exposed to the SERT paper, the Spirituality, Existential, or Religious Theological Experiences paper that they had put out, and just started learning about what they were doing over there. And they had the beginning discussions of like, hey, come out to Atlanta one of these days. And so that's how we met. And then I ended up seeing you at the Berkeley program, right, Roman?
Yeah, that's right. I remember that very distinctly. I was so nervous in that session, in that talk, and kind of a lot of this stuff felt very new, and I wasn't sure how people were going to react. And, Joe comes out and he's just got this really, you've seen him present, just a way of kind of bringing people in, and is like, yeah, I'm a physician, I've got that background, but also I have this kind of integrity that I bring to this work. And also, hey, we're the SERT people, or we're the, we represent the deep time perspective. And I was like, this person gets it. So automatically I was like, well, I think I'd like to get to know this guy better. So yeah, that was my first impression. And then of course at Berkeley, I think, yeah, Joe was one of the instructors I was taking the psychedelic facilitation training, and he was a guest instructor, and he came in and he kind of talked more in detail about some of their work and some of the history of the Church of the Eagle and Condor. But what I really remember, and I think people who have Joe come in and teach, I think this is kind of a common thing, because he sang this Icaro, and he looked around the room and like people had tears on their faces. Yeah.
And one thing I want to add is that I was like going off of their talk, which I thought was just like so inspiring to me. At the MAPS, where they brought deep time, like this idea of drawing upon the deep time, the ancestral traditions, and that these things, the spirituality and psychedelics, have always been there. And so that was it. And then Berkeley, and yeah, then teaching and sharing, but then singing, from the deep time tradition. So then I think was that this year or last year, your conference?
It was last year.
It was last year. Yeah, maybe in the fall.
April.
last year, April. Wow.
Mhm.
So I went to the Emory conference that they do there, which is incredible, I would say. And Roman is a big part of that, this interdisciplinary group. And I mean, there may be happening somewhere else, but that's why their paper was which is such a impactful thing, because it was the divinity school, with psychiatrists, with other, these other fields that were coming together to talk about this topic, and back like in the deep time, crossing these boundaries, but within the academic center. And so their conference was bridging all those worlds. Roman was one of the MCs and one of the major organizers, I think, of that. What's the title of the conference?
It's Science on Spiritual Health. So SOS is the acronym.
Yeah.
So yeah, SOS is the Science on Spiritual Health Conference, and it's the brainchild of George Grant, who's the executive director of Emory Spiritual Health, and also he's co-director of the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality, which is our center that kind of brings together a lot of the researchers in psychedelics at Emory. And as director of spiritual health, he is in charge of a vast chaplaincy service that is very warm-hearted and scientifically and evidence-minded. And I think that's a pretty rare combination in the medical space. And so his aim was to kind of bring together a conference that really makes clear, one, the relevance of these two worlds to one another. So the world of psychedelics and the world of clinical chaplaincy, clinical spiritual health. And so half the conference really represents traditional spiritual health and sort of some of the major work and researchers and thought leaders in that field. And the other half is really, I think, like, it's my favorite psychedelics conference that I attend. And it's just, really very incisive work on psychedelics, but it gives an opportunity for these two domains to really be in close conversation with one another.
And you guys have already mentioned just a couple of times SERT, just so our audience and our listeners can really understand what this means. But the spiritual, existential, religious, and theological domains. Could you kind of explain a little bit more about this, where this term has come from? What does this really look like? What is this kind of spiritually responsive care?
So SERT is an acronym that we borrowed from our colleagues at the Danielson Institute. With a lot of gratitude. They've been doing work in this area for a long time, for decades. And that includes a pretty comprehensive spiritually integrated psychotherapy approach called relational spirituality model. And so what we wanted to do was to be able to engage with these very significant spiritual, religious, but also more, right, domains that come up around psychedelics, but not to be limited by what I feel is like a very narrow understanding of what is a mystical type experience. Because that, in some ways, it's got a, if you want to be very critical, like a very reductionist, maybe colonial kind of legacy. And also it's very centered on this kind of immediate experience. And we know that a lot of people engage with these, with psychedelics, with these compounds, not because of the immediate experience themselves, but they kind of expected to have something to say to the rest of their lives, right? That's where we live. And I think, the mystical type experience, we want to know what's going on after that experience, what happened before. And so we wanted something more capacious. In religious studies or psychology of religion, you often see this R/S, religion/spirituality. And that's just kind of, it's often not as helpful as we'd like it to be. So what we really loved about the work from the Danielson is they've really fleshed out how for any given person at any given time, there's all these domains that might be alive in different ways. So there's the religious, which is the traditional, the formal, the practices, the rituals that you do, right? The existential, which is, the human confrontation with our own limitations and the challenges, anxieties, and liberation that could bring. The spiritual, which is our relationship to the sacred. And the theological, which I think often gets ignored, but, the theological is the symbolic or intellectual understanding of those things. And I think, all of us who deal with these topics, there's often an implicit theology. Like, what is the meaning of suffering? What does it take to be a good person? That is in very close conversation with these other dimensions. And for many of us, it's an explicit theology. So people who actually, they have a religion, they have a theology, they have a cosmology, right? And so this allows us to engage all of those things. I know there's a long-winded explanation, but I think it's an important thing to unpack.
I think it's very important. And I think it's very interesting, like you said, to try to get at something more universal, and I think that's what the SOS, the spiritual health, that's kind of my interest is like, okay, so you're trying to capture these different dimensions of this element. And the reason why, and for the conference, et cetera, is that like, well, the SERT paper, the line that really caught my attention was like, okay, the SERT experience, the spiritual, existential, religious, theological experiences are very common in the psychedelic assisted therapy setting. So, whether or not it's the mystical right and then and there, or however it influences the rest of their life, there's openness, there's spaciousness, there's different perspective on their life, that it's common. And to put that into a validated, published academic, like everyone's like, yeah, actually, we all kind of know that's true, but to really say it boldly with the backing of psychology and psychiatry and religious studies and the theology and the chaplaincy, and just say, yeah, this is institutionally something we agree on. And then the further statement is like, and these sort of experiences are actually relevant to clinical outcomes. So this is actually impacting people's brain, body health in a real way. So we're talking about something that is connected to the nature of things. And so then I think that's why to me, it's so interesting and powerful, because that's, I'm coming at it from, like you said, the deep time perspective, or let's say some of these ancestral traditions and some of these religious traditions that are coming into your research now, we can touch on. But these ancestral spiritual traditions, where it really was like a study of the nature of things. Sure, they can get into their dogma. They can have some areas that maybe not everyone agrees on, but they were trying to influence, faith healing tradition, that you're praying to actually hope to turn something. And, some of the famous spiritual, if we're just as an example, Jesus Christ, this idea that, okay, this is making a splash, getting people's attention because it's healing people, seems to know something about how the universe works, or, matter is somehow related to this spiritual understanding. So anyways, I'm very interested in that topic because it talks about this universal place for the SERT, that there's something here that's related to the nature of things, to how the body works, to health and well-being. And that's why it's something very relevant and even practical to be aware of.
Yeah. I think a lot of my career has been about sort of what in Christianity they sometimes call apologetics, which is, you make the argument to the other person using their own language, right? You don't sort of come at them with your language because they're going to kind of reject it outright. And it's been this kind of back and forth navigating between sort of religious studies on one hand and really like or psychology and psychotherapy, and very, straight-laced, very rigorous, often reductionist medicine and sort of biomedical models. And I think a lot of the time where we really come together is, we all really deeply care about the well-being of our patients. And we want them to thrive. We want them to improve. We want the treatments that we offer them to be effective, not just efficacious, right? And so when I was in organ transplant, right, you would get this sort of paradox a lot of the time where, we would have the medicine that the patient really needs to take, which is an anti-rejection medication. And it works. We know it works. It's been well tested, but the patient's not taking it. And why aren't they taking it, right? It doesn't matter how good your medicine is. And they have concerns. Those concerns might be spiritual. Those concerns might be relational. You might need to get their whole family into the room if they come from a culture where that matters, right? That it's not just about them. And so I think the piece that we come back to, and I think the reason that the JAMA paper was influential in some ways was it doesn't have to be like a universal truth, right? We're not trying to proclaim anything big, but I think that what comes up is, people have spirituality and they have spiritual needs and spiritual histories. And if we want to treat the whole person, we can't just ignore that part of them, especially if for many of our patients, that's like their most important part, according to them, right? So we have to be responsive, right? We have to respond to the emerging phenomena that the treatment creates. And that's true for any treatment. It's not special to psychedelics. It doesn't matter what kind of treatment you're offering. If it's going to interact with a person's religious and spiritual life, you can't just kind of like shut your ears and your eyes and pretend it's not happening.
I wanted to ask as well, you just said there about people have spirituality, they have spiritual needs, but also I'd love to know what you've witnessed in terms of those spiritual needs changing after psychedelic experiences, or kind of shifts in belief systems, worldviews, that kind of thing as well, if you've kind of come across some examples.
Yeah. So I think the the first kind of open response is, yeah, there really does seem to be a shift where people are at least attuned. Not always, right? So there's a variety of psychedelic experiences and a variety of reasons people take them, and sometimes people, there's this quote from Strassman where, he's like, well, I gave people psychedelics in a sterile room with nothing at all, and they didn't have spiritual experiences. And I don't know how true that is. Because again, I think that's one of the values of the SERT approach, because I think we're often pulled into these existential moments. And I think we could talk into the sort of the reasons why I think that happens. But what we've seen, at least in the data, when we've pulled it out, is the overwhelming majority report that their religion and spirituality has become more, not less, important in the wake of these experiences. When it comes to patients in trials and research that I've been involved in, people start to sort of say, oh, I kind of wasn't really involved in my religious tradition, but now I have things that I think I want to kind of return to or ask about or have somebody to talk to where that's meaningful. And I think people are already, when they're using psychedelics for treatment, they're in a place where they're looking for some kind of a response or an answer to a condition they haven't been able to resolve on their own, right? Whether it's mental health problems or coping with illness or something like that. So they're already in a place where they're sort of searching and seeking. So we do see this kind of a shift and an opening. The wrinkle is, I think we can sometimes represent it as like, well, people used to have belief A and now they have belief B. And that's not how any of us work. We're all living stories, right? We're always all shifting and always all changing. So it's not like, we move a person from this box to that box. This becomes a part of their journey. And I think psychedelics are special in some ways. They do tend to provoke these experiences, but also everybody's kind of on a journey, right? And so, yeah.
And that journey, this idea of, I'd like put together a intro to psychedelics for clinical psychedelics for U of A for the integrated program, and just kind of trying to bring these different perspectives together. And then at the end of the course is our friend who's a Navajo DNA medicine woman, Josie Big A James, and she's saying this thing that you just said, that okay, in the DNA tradition, the Native American tradition that she's a part of, the human being is physical, but is also emotional and mental and spiritual. And there's a spiritual element, whatever that means, whether that's, the spiritual, existential, religious, theological, some kind of term that people can relate to. I guess for her, she means this is a transcendent part of the being. And so that if the healthcare system doesn't address that, then the person won't really fully heal, or the full potential, you may be missing out on it. And so then you see, okay, people going through their experience and their healing. And one way that I put it at the end, I was like, well, I think what you're doing is helping people find like what is sacred to them and being in connection to whatever is sacred to them. It has implications for their health. That's why, that's why the transcendent experience was so, like you said, the belief system, like, oh, wow, maybe this is more important to me than I thought it was. It's because, whoa, like, I'm trying to work through my suffering and I'm finding some traction here, working through this and considering things this way, or dealing with my journey in a more, I guess, a holistic, including, my meaning, my purpose, my life, my death, my relationship to my family of origin, into the ones that have passed away, my ancestral, the future. And so that those sides of life and being aligned more deeply within themselves to what they feel is sacred, that maybe before they weren't. And then that's bringing more vitality to their experience. What do you think about that, Ramon?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much there. I don't know if y'all, I'm a big Star Trek fan.
I liked Discovery, the Discovery season 1 and 2. I thought was really. Did you see that one on Crown?
Yeah, let's not talk about Discovery.
What? All right, go ahead. As you were.
But there's the Next Generation in season 7. There, just watch this episode, and there's kind of a moment. Actually, I think they're kind of like, it's an episode that brings up kind of these, it's the 90s, so they're a little clumsy about it, but they bring up some of these kind of Native American sort of lineages. And there's a guy who's sort of like a faith leader figure, and he talks to this young guy, and he's like, what do you think is sacred here? And, Wesley Crusher's like, I don't know, I guess the necklace that you're wearing, or the signs. And he's like, no, everything here is sacred. And you are a sacred person. And if we don't treat the sacred with respect, then we are profaning something that is holy. And how do you relate to yourself? And the guy's like, well, I guess I haven't been treating myself with very much respect lately. Right. So I think that there's a kind of a sensibility that can come to us, right? When there's a recognition that, yeah, what you're dealing with, you and in your relationships, when that is sacred, you kind of come to this sense of, maybe to use an Abrahamic term, God doesn't make trash. Right. And there's something really important there. So that's the one side. But I always kind of bring up, like religion, spirituality, it gives with one hand and takes with the other. Right. And there are many ways in which, I don't think that just having a sacred dimension or a spiritual dimension, that's always necessarily a positive, right? Because much like psychedelics, I think this is a non-specific amplifier, right? And so it can amplify the positive, but also it can give people license to bypass. It can give people license to act in ways that probably are not helpful toward themselves or to others. And this is actually something I really like about something like the relational spirituality model for psychotherapy, because on one hand, we want to be very, very careful not to impose spiritual values, spiritual beliefs, worldviews onto people who are already kind of in a vulnerable situation, whether because they're patients or because they're seekers or because they're sort of in a new place for them, right? But on the other hand, we're in contact. And there's going to be transformation through contact. And so you can't just say, oh, I'm not going to even touch this or talk about it, right? And there are some spiritual and religious dynamics that may be more or less helpful than others, right? So a sense of like walking around feeling like you're no good and you somehow, you're being punished all the time for something that really isn't your fault, right? I don't know how helpful that is, for example.
So this is a big issue, and I think it's because, like you said, there's so much room for interpretation and discernment around these mysterious elements. That's one of the ideas I'm trying to explore in the new book, and it's based on some of like your work and the spiritual health piece. It's like, okay, so we think there's this portal into the sacred, that could be nourishing. That if we don't treat if we are in fact sacred, then it would be an ignorance to treat ourselves as less than that, and that would be somehow, like I said, help open you to an access of some kind of metaphysical resource, in a sense. So then there's all the charlatans and all the, whatever, the self-punishment, and then there's things that get kind of off track. And we see the abuses and all over the place, whether it's in these ancestral spiritual traditions or a Star Trek faith healer or, large scale religion. So my exploration, my idea based on the kind of interdisciplinary work that you are all doing is just like, hey, now while we've tried to bring this universal reductionist model that's been trying to say, okay, get that separate church and state, let's just see what can we really measure and all agree on and say that's there. And that body of knowledge and science has been growing in the internet and on all the resources and the communication that we have. But now there is like a sense of like, okay, what's physically healthy? We can just agree on that across the different laboratory exams happening from here to wherever it is in the world. And then now psychological measures, there's a lot of like agreement. So, okay, this person's anxious or depressed or, this struggling with this trauma that it's getting through the cultural diversity. And then you have even emotional processing issues and the related biology of those issues rooted in a kind of a mammalian system and understanding how that is there. And now these measures of spiritual well-being, to get a sense of people's sense of meaning and purpose and how that relates to even clinically is correlated to healthcare outcomes. So then we can use the health and the well-being and their relationships, the quality of their relationships in their life with themselves, with their loved ones, et cetera, their community. Can we use those elements to assess whether or not the person is in fact aligned with this sacred spirituality that they claim? So then that's what I propose. It's like, okay, you don't need to explain it to me and convince me of your belief system. I want to take a look at your community. And it's not to judge, but it's something we could reflect and say, well, hey, mental health in your community is actually, it's struggling. We're seeing you're promoting these religious beliefs that you're really getting behind. And I see that there's a lot of, so maybe there's some areas there to reflect on that if you're in fact so aligned with God or divinity, whatever it is you claim, like, hey, maybe these areas should be better. So can we reflect and say that? So now I don't have to be convinced. It's like if a very like simple example is like in the Peruvian ayahuasca world that I was, immersed in, and where you see a lot of examples of healers being abusive and predatory and taking advantage of women and harming people as one example, other forms of harm as well. But that one where they say, oh, well, they needed a sexual healing and that's why it needed to happen. And, I said, well, how come they're so screwed up afterwards? You're telling me you did the right thing and it was so aligned and this is what needed to happen. But no, actually the results by all measures, including modern scientific measures, psychological measures, emotional, spiritual, mental health measures, it's like, no, you actually made everything worse. So is there a place for science and spirituality around health and well-being to kind of move this discussion forward of hey, we're not trying to judge spiritual beliefs, but we're saying we should reflect on this.
Yeah, and provided that we are adding sufficient nuance. There's an issue because you can describe anything in the language of science or medicine or whatever. So I've seen this a lot of time when I work with adverse effects, where a person is really struggling after something, and the people who are offering them guidance are saying, "You're on the right path. This is a sign that you're healing," right? And, I've met people where, like, it's been years and they're like, "When's the healing gonna start?" Right? I keep, like, being told that this is a long kind of healing journey, but you can create a model. You can create a sort of a medical model or looks medical, it smells medical, right? Where this is, kind of the expected kind of theory of change, right? Is that, and maybe for some of these transgressors, and this is a problem, I think, for anybody in the role of a care responder, right? When our egos get in the way or we do something and we want to create a self-serving narrative that, oh, it's for the best. I didn't make a mistake, right? I'm not, I'm not to blame here. This is actually going exactly as planned. So I think these measures are definitely good. I'm as a clinician, I really think measurement-based care is important. We really do need to measure how people do. There's this idea in some worlds of the psychotherapy kind of a continuum, and often the parts that have made their ways into the psychedelic continuum is that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that's just not what the evidence says. The evidence says that for most people, it gets better before it gets better, and it gets worse before it gets worse. Or not to say that this is like a prediction that if you're doing worse, that it's only going to get worse. It's more that if you're trying a new therapy and you're finding that you're actually not doing so much better with it, maybe that means you should be trying a different therapy, right? Maybe that's what that means. And it's not like, oh, it's working. That's the way you know it's working is that it hurts. I mean, there are exceptions, and I've also talked to people who have absolutely like had their sort of dark valley experience, and they've come out of it and they reflect on it and they say they've improved and their life is much better. That absolutely happens. But in general, for most patients, for most people, if you're trying something and it feels harmful, maybe try something else is my kind of gentle suggestion.
I have two questions there. One was you just mentioned measurement-based care. So I wonder whether we can define more what this is. What does this mean? What does this look like? And then I'll ask my other one after, which is about kind of the adverse effects and harm reduction that you're speaking about.
Measurement-based care is something that I think in the clinical fields will just you want to assess how it's going. So we have very good evidence that psychotherapists who collect data from their patients on a regular basis and actually look at the data. That's the important thing. So some people collect it and don't look at it. But you're treating depression, so you collect depression scores. And you actually look at it, those psychotherapists are just by a mile more effective than the ones who don't collect that data and who don't look at it. So that's all measurement-based care is. And I think in the same way, if you're getting a round of chemotherapy, right, and you're not getting regular scans, if you're not getting regular sort of assessments that see how well the therapy is doing, right, you're just kind of like in a black box for a year of treatment. Well, that might not be helpful. You need to be able to change course based on how well or how poorly the therapy is doing. Can I just add one thing about that measurement-based care piece? Because again, I think sometimes we can get a little reductionistic here in an unhelpful way. So I think some of the things that are really important to measure, we haven't really gotten good enough at measuring yet.
So then what is actually healing? What is actually therapeutic? What is actually bringing measurable improvement in health and well-being is what's guiding us. So the Mosaic Initiative, so there are religious traditions and spiritual traditions that have community elements and things that you can look into. And you were telling us a little bit earlier about this new, I think you said, is it the Jewish Journey?
Yeah, this is the Jewish Journey study. So maybe I'll just share very briefly kind of about this Mosaic Initiative that we're doing, because it's part of really kind of a raft of studies that is looking at these questions in different ways. So it's an interdisciplinary initiative with a number of projects in it that blends sort of the humanities and the sciences and also the clinical and relational pieces. And in this initiative, we're looking at a range of both how psychedelics are impacting the religious lives of people from different backgrounds, but also how religion is shaping the reception of psychedelics. It's kind of a two-way street. And one of the studies, which was thanks to funding from Common Era, from the Jim Joseph Foundation, we were able to partner with a group called Shefa, which is a group that offers Jewish psychedelic support. To me, it feels like this study I've always wanted to see, which was a well-powered study of the Jewish community and how they have been encountering psychedelics and what psychedelics have been doing for them, what their perspectives are. This includes people who have tried and who have not tried psychedelics, people who are from very different parts of the Jewish community. Some people are like, I'm an atheist and I never go to a Jewish event. And some people are like, well, I am Hasidic or Orthodox and I am very much involved. And so as you might imagine, again, as a non-specific amplifier, I think what we're seeing is that psychedelics seem to be very, very relevant for these communities. We just had a respondent, our first sharing of these data, we had a rabbi respond who was like, well, in my community, I've like just in the recent past, I've had like 6 people come to me with questions about psychedelics. And, this is a community with a very rich mystical tradition and with a very complicated kind of relationship to its own mysticism, I think. So we just collected data from 1,126 people. And we are now in the process of writing up those data. Hopefully they'll be published in the next year.
And which psychedelics are we speaking about as well? Like which psychedelics are very prominent in the release?
So we asked people what psychedelics they've used and how much of them they've used. And the most common is psilocybin, followed closely by LSD, MDMA. And then just because people will often refer to ketamine as a psychedelic, and there are scientific debates that I don't really care to get into. But so we asked about that, and ketamine is in there as well. And the person who tried psychedelics at the earliest age in that study, that was 10 years old. And the person who tried psychedelics at the latest age was 71. They tried it for the first time at 71 years old. And so some people are very experienced. They have 59 years of experience. And some people, they literally just tried them for the first time, like last week. So it's a real amazing breadth of what people have done and how they've done it and the reasons that they've done it.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that as well, more about kind of the reasons behind it. Like for the people who have been taking these psychedelics for a very long time, you said over like 59 years. Has this become part of their routine, their practice, their connection to their spirituality? Or has it been because there's an underlying health issue or something else that's behind it?
It really varies. So for some people, right, that has really become a part of their spiritual path and their way that they practice their faith, right? For some, they grew up as a party kid, right? And it's sort of a part of that world. Again, none of these things are universal. There's so much variety. So some people say, I absolutely do not think that psychedelics should be mixed with Judaism. And this includes from people who have taken psychedelics, right? Yeah, so it varies a lot. In terms of reasons, I think that the most common reasons people would say is like curiosity, spirituality, and fun, right? Followed by like therapeutic type of reasons. But what kind of surprised me is that over a third of the people who had done psychedelics said that they had done them. One of the reasons was to heal generational or ancestral trauma, which I think for this population is very much alive, right, as a topic.
Thanks, Roman. And in terms of your other studies, I know that you have one called the Post-Psychedelic Challenges study and the Meditation Challenges study as well, which are all about harm reduction when it comes to the difficult or adverse experiences of psychedelic use. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
I'm really focusing on better understanding when things don't go well after psychedelics. I'm not talking about a bad trip. I'm talking about the trip is over and then a person is having a lot of distress or impairment and they're struggling basically. There's not a lot of good research on what that's like, what it means clinically, and how we can support people who are in those situations. It's not particularly common, right? And it's not the end of the world if it happens, right? I sort of see it as a kind of like, you're an athlete and you went out and you did something that's kind of adventurous, and sometimes people get injured and you can rehab an injury and get back into your life, but we need to know how to do that. So we're running a very large, ambitious study that is really trying to do justice to this question. So we're recruiting folks who might have had negative impacts or sort of have struggled after taking a psychedelic. And you can find the study. It's very easy. It's just psychedelicchallenges.org. And there's a companion study. If you've had that kind of experience after meditation, right? So it's a two-arm study, and there's reasons why we want to collect information about both sort of in tandem. So if you've had those kinds of experience after meditation practice, we're also really interested, and that is meditationchallenges.org. But we would really love to sort of hear from folks if they've had those kinds of experiences. I think it would really help support people who could really use that help in the future.
I think that's wonderful. I think it's super important to back to this measured driven outcomes and yeah, this is an issue. This is an issue that the whole society wants to know about, and the fears around more inclusion of psychedelics, and then also bringing out, but like you said, that it's like, hey, meditation practices sometimes are leading to these kind of experiences, or even other forms of spiritual practice might also lead to these experiences. So it's not for me, it's not so much about, okay, well, throw the baby out with the bathwater, like they say, but it's like, okay, yeah, with psychedelics, it's a serious issue to consider, and to really bring that out into the open and connect that into this other work, and give it a place to breathe and hopefully heal. So I think it's so important for everyone to contribute to the study. Their work has been so impactful. Emory, the way there's one thing is to run a study, but then, how do you analyze things? How do you publish the material in a way that's really gonna get the word out? And so I think it would be wonderful if people could contribute, the people that are listening to this, to your work there at Emory.
And also maybe how you've seen the chaplaincy services assist with this as well.
Yeah, so a lot of what I've seen around what chaplains or spiritual health practitioners do, and I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that. So
Yeah.
so that's a person with a lot of deep training. So these are spiritual care specialists. They have a master's degree. They have thousands of hours of clinical experience, often in medical settings. They have board certifications, peer review. So these are really well-trained clinicians. And what they are trained to do is to provide care for people experiencing SERT distress, people from any or no faith background, right? So that's what I mean. And we've had a lot of positive responses to our inclusion of spiritual health clinicians in psychedelic work. So when they're part of the treatment team, that's been very well received. There's a sense that they can attune to issues that more kind of medically or psychologically trained people don't always catch. And their approach is very different. I heard this at a training recently from Tara Dionath, and she kind of pulled this line. She's like, don't just do something, stand there, right? Where there's this kind of like doing ethos that we have in medicine a lot. And sometimes what you need to do, and what chaplains are very good at, is they can stand there in a very effective, but also engage with people's spiritual concerns. For people who experience challenges, something that we've noticed is when you ask about it, what kind of challenges have you experienced? People absolutely talk about spiritual challenges and spiritual struggles. And again, this is a small sampling, right? So this is just among those people who have experienced difficulties, right? When you ask them about it, a lot of the time, and that shouldn't be surprising because a lot of the benefits are spiritual, right? It affects your spirituality. So sure, when there's difficulty, why wouldn't that have a spiritual ramification too, right? And so what I've seen informally is that a lot of the time, spiritual health clinicians or clergy, they're the people that folks turn to when they're going through a tough time, and they seem to be responding to these kinds of questions with a lot of integrity.
I think it's very interesting. I think that maybe sometimes, perhaps, like the difficulty that some people are going through is that they didn't necessarily have that level of support around them at the time to that's gonna address things, like you say, well, into the spiritual, or we say like into the consciousness, or however it is, for instance, to be there, to stand there. But what is that person doing differently than the other person? And yeah, they're engaging, in this multidimensional way that you're talking about, that we keep getting back at. It's like, okay, are you able to engage with a person at this spiritual level, which typically means that you can only take somebody as far as you're willing to go. And so, has that person that has that wisdom that's been through, the trials and tribulations of their mind, of their life, of their traumas, of their, experience, to be able to hold that space for that person, but to really, like, all the way into, the torturedness of the soul, and to be there. And that's why, let's say in the chaplains that we, were exposed to, then this is a very interesting area, as a doctor in the hospital, and then look at the chaplains in the hospital, and to go into the heart-wrenching situation of, somebody just died, or they're dying, or, somebody just lost their child. So here we are, and who's going to hold that space to say life can still be sacred through this? And so there's all this development around that. And I think it's really interesting. And to me, going to the Emory conference and hearing this term like spiritual healthcare provider, and I brought it up there, that I was just excited because I said, going to Peru, for example, and the Shipibos and the curanderos that have their own name, the Onanya, for their work and their culture, but that they don't like being called shamans because it's this imposition from some, term from Siberia or wherever it is. But if you said spiritual healthcare provider, they'd be like, hey, I can get on board with that. And that's actually, I think, what, I don't know, the connotation for us of curandero, that's what it means. That it's like somebody it's a healer, but the person that's going to bring that spiritual sensibility to their healing work. And so then the one thing I just want to add, one more tag thing on here to ask you, because it's something that got brought up while we were there, is like, okay, so let's say somebody, for example, one of the ideas is, and this right now we're in ketamine, which I do argue that it is psychedelic because of the similar effects on the neural networks and on the neuroplasticity that's shared across these other things that also work through different receptors. And so the idea that, hey, if you have people coming into a hospital, let's say suicidal, and you have all this evidence to show that ketamine can help people out of suicidality. And if you were to try to, or for something else, or end of life anxiety, or whatever it is, they happen to be in the hospital or coming into the hospital. And, they could benefit perhaps from a session, let's say, of ketamine with a spiritual healthcare provider present to help them work through something. And I heard about it at Emory, that idea. I was like, oh, that's so fascinating, because the chaplain, let's say, is already on staff, and then the ketamine is so cheap, and you could explore it. I don't know. Well, has anything come of that, those ideas?
Yeah, I don't want to misstate, just because this isn't my research. This is research that folks like Ali John Zarabi and Caroline Peacock and a number of others are engaged in, or moving toward here at Emory. But I think that is a major thing that we're exploring right now, is actually bringing spiritual health clinicians, it's the antidote in a way to people talk about these kind of ketamine clinics that are kind of like, industrial farming, right? Where you just have people kind of hooked up and there's a TV playing like Fox News or something, or a game show. And it's like, what a lost opportunity. And sometimes, people kind of describe these iatrogenic or negative, impacts. Well, yeah, you came and did this thing and you had something happen, and then you kind of you had no point of reference, nobody who would even just like listen to you as, kind of going back to as a being who is sacred, right? Um, that's too bad. And so, yeah, we're working on that right now.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting avenue. And so it's like, it's related to harm reduction. And I think that's what a lot of traditional people would say about these, like you said, the factory ketamine. It's okay, you're opening up these spaces and places and these portals. Some people are going to have SERT experiences on ketamine, and it does happen. If you don't support that well, and we're saying that would include some kind of spiritually integrated support, to be like more optimal, yeah, you may be causing more harm.
Was just going to say, you also mentioned end of life, Joe, too. And you said about life being sacred, but also maybe we can look at death being sacred too, and how people can be led through that experience. You said about kind of having this guide, this spiritual healthcare provider, perhaps during end of life as well. So I wondered, Roman, about your experience with end of life.
So interestingly enough, I've kind of been involved in the psychedelics side and also on the sort of end of life side, more in my sort of like clinical experience and background. Never really both at the same time. To me, I think end of life is one of the most important and sacred moments in a person's life. And I think recognizing it and treating it in that way is something that we're not very good at in our culture. Some of my own sort of teachers and guides in this, I can't talk about it without mentioning Joan Halifax and her being with dying training, which I've done. And she's got a wonderful book on the topic as well, which I think everybody should read. In some traditions, we sort of think of, all of our life is really just a preparation for our dying. And I think as if that's something that sort of resonates for you, pick up the book. It could be very impactful. And so, yeah, it really kind of does bring all of these topics together, right? So I think what we hope out of psychedelics for end of life anxiety, as we call it, although anxiety is kind of like, it makes it into a little, like anxiety is what I feel, before I get a test score back. We're not just talking about anxiety, right? We're talking about maybe something more like what the existentialists would call angst, right?
Dread.
Dread, yeah, or just, like all of it, right? All of the stuff of the human condition, right? It's all there. And so the way that we show up as a community around dying, right? And sort of being with people as they die, I think is incredibly important. Psychedelics, hopefully, I think, and this is what they seem to enable, is for people to walk through that process with their eyes more open. And I think sometimes people can shut down and remove themselves from their most vital connections. And some of that is depression, some of that is the clinical sort of illness presentation. And I think what we've seen is it really can help people really be a little more present, have integrity, maybe have a little bit less fear. Although I don't think fear is pathological. I think fear is fine, right? So what people seem to describe sometimes is, all of those, like your concretized self, right? So who you are in terms of your job titles, your descriptors, right? The things that we really identify with. And some of these psychedelic experiences, all of that kind of like becomes a little more contingent, peripheral, and that can produce profound anxiety. But it's the same kind of anxiety that dying produces, right? Because that is all of that stuff that's kind of being pulled away. And when people kind of can move through that, what it gives you access to also, because your concretized self, right, is sort of a little more peripheral, maybe it gives you access to something that feels a little bit more kind of underlying or foundational, right? And that can be a real resource for folks. I don't want to put too many words around it because I think it really can be different. And it is absolutely possible to have a psychedelic experience. I have had experiences like that where you sort of look for this, oh, I'm going to find what my eternal self is like. And actually there's nothing there. So I don't want to like say, oh, you're gonna really feel like their eternal soul. And that's not necessarily what's going to happen, right? Yeah.
And just like the same way that somebody could maybe overly assign meaning to this experience of their eternal soul, the person who doesn't find it also could overly assign meaning to that.
Yes.
That it is a mystery. And so the reality of relating to the mystery is there's a lot of humility. I believe that for those that really want to learn more and understand it more, they're maybe over asserting their ideas, and this concretized self is getting in the way of understanding, something deeper and more. And so that's the beauty. And I think in the academia, when we approach this topic, it's keeping that alive, right? That humility to keep the open-mindedness. And I think you're all doing that, and it's taking us further. I think that's the new phase of this science spirituality relationship, where it's not about, before it was kind of like, I'm right, you're wrong. That's the battle between the scientists and then the religious people. And okay, that's as far as we're getting. And now it's like, okay, wow, like, humbly, I want to learn more.
Yeah. And it's, again, kind of going back to what we really all care about is the care seeker, right? Is the person who is the patient, and we can all get on the same page about that. And I think providing care, it absolutely, it is a humbling experience.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about is that I know, Roman, you've looked into other ways that people can reach altered states, not just through psychedelic, but also through meditation. And also I heard from a little birdie that you're very into your saunas. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that as well, and how you feel that has informed your work with psychedelics.
Sure. I've generally, I think, since pretty early on, have been very interested in sort of how people have these sort of unusual, direct, powerful experiences. I think my first sort of transcendent or altered or, unusual states occurred spontaneously without any kind of substance. But then in my own personal history, I think, first it was probably psychedelics, and then it was meditation. And something that really struck me was like, wow, you go on some of these meditation retreats and what you experience becomes very, very similar to what you get on a psychedelic. So, I think for me, I'm kind of, in some ways, I'm kind of a William James style pragmatist, where it's like, well, what do these do for you? What role does it play in your relationships? What role does it like? How does it become alive in your life? And so I think that's true for sauna as well. It's really interesting, right? So like our body thermoregulates, and that thermoregulation seems to be like bound up with our health and our chronotropy or chronobiology in some really interesting ways. And so I think like Ashley Mason is a researcher, and she's doing fascinating work on this. And so like exposure to high heat when the body is not doing it on its own, right? Or when it's struggling in ways like depression, right? There's pretty good evidence, and please don't try this at home, right? But that like exposure to high heat, raising the body temperature, seems to have a salutary effect for these things. But what's interesting is you see kind of in cultures all around the world, I don't know if it's a universal, but it's pretty close. There is a kind of, these heat raising practices, and they're often community practices, which is also really interesting, right? So whether it's like temescal or inipi or sauna or banya, or Finnish smoke sauna or hammam, right? There's the Korean sauna, there's hot springs. And so for me, I did sauna as a kid, just going to the Russian banya, and I loved it. Absolutely, it can produce an altered state. So there's a moment where you sort of come out of the sauna, and at least for me, it's and this hasn't been studied, which is kind of wild to me. The inner monologue just kind of quiets, and you're just kind of in this spacious space, right? And you're sort of around others, and it can be a very community building thing as well. So I have a lot of curiosity about that.
I know that's very interesting. The sweat lodge, those traditions, they're for prayer, for healing, and for building community. Well, thank you, Roman. That was a really special conversation with you. It's amazing your journey. We had asked the Instagram, who should we have, and they asked for you. So we're excited that we're able to schedule with you. I think it's such a beautiful perspective that you bring, and I think it's honest and it's caring, and I love the Emory group, that there is a warm-heartedness that is so special to find in an academic kind of scene, and it speaks to this connectedness. I think that's one of my favorite things that's coming out of the psychedelic research, as they're trying to find these transcendent, measurable things to discuss. And one of them is this connectedness. And I think there is a sense of connectedness over there that brings that warmth forward. And thank you for your part in encouraging that.
Thank you so much, Roman.
This was such a treat. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for joining us for today's discussion with Roman Palitsky. Please see the show notes to find links to the Emory University website, where you can learn more about his work. You'll also find more information about the psychedelicchallenges.org and meditationchallenges.org studies mentioned during the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit follow so you never miss another episode. And if you'd like to stay more connected, Dr. Joe Tafur has a monthly newsletter and Patreon call, which you can find in the show notes. At Modern Spirit, we also receive donations to help provide scholarships for people to join our retreats, courses, and events. Remember, if you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for future guests, feel free to reach out to info@modernspirit.com. Thank you so much.